Hello and welcome to a very special Winning Agenda interview with Alex Forndran, a longtime friend of the Winning Agenda, also known as Firesa, who's recently won an Adelaide Regionals in Adelaide, Australia. How are you, Alex?
I'm really good. Thank you for having me, Jesse.
That's all right. And we've got a nice little picture of you here up on the screen for our viewers with your Tunic playmat draped over your shoulder and your little son Leon holding your Tunic card. Is that right?
That's it. Yeah, exactly. All of the valuable stuff will end up with him one day anyway. So let's start with the tunic and go from there.
Nice, nice. So, Alex, what we're planning to do today is to talk through your Chane deck list, which we've got here up on the screen as well for viewers. And viewers, we're going to sort of talk through all of the card choices, how Alex sort of plays the deck and thinks about the deck, and some of the strategies that you might employ if you're running into your own Road to Nationals in the next couple of weeks. Alex, I guess before we dive into the deck list, just talk us through sort of how the day went for you, how it felt, and what some of your highlights were.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, we were very lucky to be able to have a Road to Nationals in the first place. People within Australia and outside of Australia are at different levels of lockdown or restrictions. So it was quite clear to all of us that we were quite fortunate, even if it meant spending 7, 8 hours playing card games wearing face masks. So in that respect, it did bring the community together, even if at the same time these Road to Nationals events feel like they're an opportunity for different communities from different places around, your state or your country to come together. So we missed the Melbourne and Sydney contingents, but hopefully there'll be events in the not too distant future where we all get to play together.
And for a little bit of historical context on that sort of interstate travel, it would have been, gosh, I don't know how many years ago now, but back when Alex and I both used to play Netrunner, as I mentioned, Alex is a longtime friend of the channel. We travelled to Netrunner Worlds together when Alex made top 8, which was pretty exciting. But many, many moons ago, we also played off in the final of an Adelaide Netrunner Regionals. So all that interstate competition is good fun.
Yeah, exactly. It's great. It's great to build communities across state lines like that because despite the fact that, Australia is sort of isolated, even within Australia, everything is kind of so far apart that we don't really get to play each other all that often. So yeah, exactly. It definitely reminded me a little bit of that regional and kind of just missing that being able to play with people from interstate. So yeah, hopefully soon.
Hopefully soon. And for our international viewers and listeners, from Melbourne to Adelaide, which is probably the closest or equidistant closest capital city to
Mm.
Melbourne, on the mainland anyway, it's about an 8-9 hour drive, about 850 Ks. So it's
That sounds correct,
fair
yeah.
way, isn't it? Fair
Yeah.
drive, fair hike,
Yeah.
as we would say. So yes, anyway, wonderful to have you on here via the wonderful power of the internet, Alex, to share your thoughts with us. In terms, other than missing us wonderful interstaters, what were some of your reflections or highlights from the tournament itself?
Yeah, the day itself was great. First of all, starting at 10 a.m. was excellent because I'm not really a fan of tournaments that start at midday or 1 p.m. because
Yeah.
as we all know, those events can go on for ages. So an early start was great, and just being able to see a few communities come together, and then beyond that, seeing quite a diverse range of heroes actually show up. So we
Mm.
had 6 or 7 chains, which was, for some people that would be horrible to hear. But beyond that, I think most heroes were represented, and there was quite an even spread. So, you had Axis Dorinthia, and you had OTK Viserai, and you had different flavors of Bolton and Katsu and everything. So it's just really, really nice to be able to see so many different heroes and people being very passionate about playing those heroes as well. So,
Yeah.
um, and despite the fact that we had so many chains, I was fortunate enough not to have to play a chain until the last round of Swiss, which was really nice being able to not play against chain until the end of the day.
And is that because it's nice to play against people who are doing a different thing to you, or you don't enjoy mirror matches generally, or do you specifically not enjoy the chain mirror match?
I think, yeah, it's a good question. I think for me, part of it is that I haven't played the game all that long at this stage. I think sort of 7, 8 weeks in. So there's just so much still to learn, and uh, it feels like being able to play against not only different players but different heroes and seeing different people's takes on those heroes just lets you get more. It feels like you get more out of the day.
Yeah.
When it comes to the chain mirror match, people have had different opinions on that. Some will tell you, whoever goes first wins, and it's all up to the banishers and everything else. But I don't really agree with that.
Yep.
So,
Me neither. I mean,
yeah.
those two things are both inconsistent, aren't
No,
they?
exactly. Yeah. Sounds like excuses to me. But no, I mean,
Yeah.
I was hoping to at some stage play some of the chain mirror matches just because I brought cards along for that scenario.
Hmm.
But yeah, at the same time, it was good to sort of have a nice, enjoyable first half to the day and then just be able to focus on playing 4 or 5 chain mirror matches in a row at the end. So, yeah.
Awesome. And before we dive into the deck tech, I should say as well, Alex is going to be procuring a webcam shortly, and we will try and get some gameplay footage up at some point in the next few weeks of Alex and I testing these decks and other things, which will be a lot of fun. And it'll be great to have you around on the channel a bit, Alex, to record some games now that you've dived into Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Awesome. So talk us through just the equipment suite of your deck. I mean, the chain equipment suite generally is reasonably well set for most people, and this is sort of treading the middle ground in terms of what most chain decks are playing. But the headpiece is probably the interesting part here, where you've got 3 different options in your deck.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, the first thing to notice is that not playing headpieces, but in terms of the chest piece, I just
Yeah,
stuck to the carrion husk
not having the iron weave
and
is notable.
neglected the iron weave. And I think that's a perfectly fine way to go. The iron weave is a really, really strong card, and if you expect to see, I'm not sure, maybe sort of control dash decks or other decks that ping you for a little bit of damage but are never going to be particularly aggressive, then maybe the Iron Weave is a nice way to apply pressure early. But the Carrion Husk is great, and I mean, I don't think I need to convince anyone that it's one of the best cards in the game.
Yep. What are some highlights of things you blocked with Carrion Husk? Just to give our viewers who might not be as familiar with it as a card an idea of how important it can be in some matchups. Like, what are some of the big blocks
Yeah.
that you got off with it?
Um, Look, it's especially when considering that Arcanite Skullcap also can provide 2 armor, and then the Grasp of the Arcanite prevents yet another 2 armor. It lets you block just about anything. I mean, game-ending crippling crushers will never come anywhere near you as long as you're conservative early on in the game and keep all of that armor ready for when it matters. And oftentimes, if you're in a racing scenario, which this deck does like to do, just having the ability to absorb all of that damage and not expend the cards in your hand, that finite resource, and instead just present that amount of armor that at a critical juncture will stop that Mugenshi, will stop that CNC plus a pummel, ridiculous things that will finish games if they get through. The Carrion Husk just sits there and generally doesn't discourage people from playing those cards because they need to force you to at some point use the Carrion Husk. But it's just gross. So yeah, no,
Yeah,
it's
and
it's a very good card.
some others that I've sort of seen along the way have been things like Herald of Judgment out of Prism that can stop you from playing cards in the Banished Zone, or if it hits, or Herald of Erudition with Dominate.
Definitely that. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So you went all in on the Husk, but what about the Crown, the Ebb and Fold, and the Skullcap? What were your matchups where you thought those 3 could play a role?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Crown of Dichotomy didn't come in until the night before, and to be perfectly honest, it came in out of respect for those matchups where Arcane Barrier 1 might be relevant. So, knowing that a few people locally did play Viserai, I wanted to have that there. And just in case someone played Kano and ended up playing particularly well, or just ended up getting matched up with me at some stage. I didn't want to not have that option. The Skullcap does provide Arcane Barrier as well, just not in the form that you generally want to have to use it.
Yep.
Plus, Kano starting on 30 means most of the time that Arcane Barrier will be off anyway, so the Crown just provides that option. And I did play it in round one against a Viscerai deck, and it did what it was meant to, so yeah.
So
As
definitely good
for,
to have it there.
yeah, certainly don't regret bringing it in, and I will do so again. As for the Ebb and Fold and the Skullcap, I feel like um, they are both very good cards, and the Skullcap does an excellent job of providing that defense that doesn't tax your hand. Whereas the Ebb and Fold um, is one card that a lot of other people are still playing in the deck, and it certainly can serve as a bit of a catch-up mechanic if you're going second, particularly in the mirror match.
Hmm.
I found that I only cited it in once, and in the end, didn't regret doing so, but would have probably preferred playing the Skull Cap anyway. So in many ways, the fact that I'm a newer player means that being able to lean on powerful cards like Skull Cap make things just a little bit more straightforward for me. I know what the game plan is. I know I want to use my equipment to block at the right time so that I don't have to use cards from hand.
Hmm.
And the Skull Cap fits into that plan really well.
Yeah, cool. That makes sense. And I think, as you've described, having the three pieces of equipment in the husk, the skull cap, and the grasp, when you play that combination that can all block pretty heavily, it's a pretty significant advantage over the
Yeah.
course of a game against some heroes that don't have that. So moving on away from the equipment, we've got a pretty standard three red Demigons, three Command and Conquers, three Enlightened Strike, but three red Flock of the Featherwalker, which is one that has come in the last couple of weeks
Yeah.
to more chain decks. Talk us through sort of why that one's come in, and but also how you felt it played, because I know that a lot of people who have thought about this card, and certainly I felt this way about it. It's got two restrictions to it in the chain deck. One being that you need to reveal, or I guess there's three restrictions. Three restrictions. One means you need to reveal, so it can't be the last card you play from your hand, but you also can't give a go again with your Soul Shackles. So you need to be holding something.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as you were kind of going through those red cards in the deck, I feel like hopefully to the listeners it'll be clear that a lot of them are just really powerful cards on their own. Like they just present a lot of damage in one card, and in that respect, Flock fits that plan quite well. But those restrictions definitely, so the ones that you mentioned before, definitely do influence the way in which you might see your first few turns play out, particularly because Flock, rather than what some people think, serving the purpose of helping you against decks that try and fatigue you out, is actually more about helping you have stronger early turns. In that, one, it provides 5 power on for one that will then eventually set up or will hopefully set up a better follow-up turn.
Yep.
But at the same time, hopefully leads you to play lines that are in fact a bit more conducive to the chain game plan, which is to say that you probably don't want to be blocking early. You do want to be holding a card in hand that you then hopefully arsenal.
Yep.
You don't want to go all in every single turn. You want to set up those turns so that you might only be dealing or threatening 10 or 11 damage on turn 2 or 3, but then turns 3/4, might be threatening 17 or 18 damage each time just because you got that quicken token in and you've got a Plunder Run in arsenal or something else. And ultimately, in terms of how it changed the way I might have had to play some turns, I think it's a matter of simply practicing with the card in your deck and not overcommitting to having to play it.
Yep.
So that means sometimes just pitch it for one, and don't get too caught up in trying to make it work. If anything, it might force you to change your pitch order so that you have one pitch floating as well as your flock and the last card in hand so that you can then play the flock and either hold on to or arsenal that last card.
Yep.
But yeah, I have to admit on the day itself, it was really, really strong. And I would say in at least two of the chain mirrors, it made the difference early on and led to games that were, I don't want to say one-sided, but certainly in my favor from that point onwards. So.
Sure. And if you can grab that early damage lead and force your opponent to start blocking, start using their husk, start being on the back foot, it can be very hard for them to recover.
Exactly. And the other thing is, it's not even so much about having a damage lead, but the thing is, if at the end of their turn, your life totals are roughly the same, but it's now your turn, you're ahead by that one turn.
Oh,
So
yeah.
sometimes I would look down at my life total and it would be, at 25 and theirs would be at 27, but I would feel miles ahead just because, if they didn't block my next turn out, the game was practically over. So they were on the back foot from that point onwards. So.
Absolutely.
And the
in
flux enable that.
Yeah, sure. And Enlightened Strike, I think, is something that is probably for newer players to Chane, something really similar in that you don't necessarily always need to play it. In fact, there'll be many hands where playing your Enlightened Strike and committing 2 cards to it is not the right thing to do. But and just pitching it is much better, even if you're very likely to banish it later. But having it there as an option in case you either do need to block and be left with a 2-card hand, or even just if it does turn out that it's mathematically the best thing to do, it's an extremely powerful card in and of itself, and having that option in itself is a powerful thing.
Yeah, I agree. Enlightened Strike is a really good card. I think both old and new players alike will read the text and quickly understand just how flexible that card is. But just like Flock, it depends on you as the pilot keeping as many cards in hand as possible, which at times will force awkward situations if they can in fact force you to block out of hand. And at that point, it might not be worth overcommitting to just getting an Enlightened Strike out. Being willing to pitch it for that red and then moving on is something that some players might need to get used to.
Sure. And then we've got 3 Ghostly Visits, 2 red Howl, and 3 red Plunder Run, 3 red Riftbind, which are sort of all very commonly played red cards. Was there anything you wanted to specifically comment on those ones before we move on?
Yeah, I'm quite a big fan of Howl from Beyond.
Yep.
2 is quite an investment, but it synergizes very, very well with the rest of the deck. Even if you're just sticking onto, you're adding the Howl onto a Command and Conquer or whatever else, it's doing plenty of work, but then combined with all of the cards that do need you to play a non-attack action to cut them out of banish, just makes it very useful.
Sure.
Whereas I think the list only ran 1 Rip Through Reality, which has been quite a bit more common in some of the other lists I've seen, and just hasn't been a card that's impressed me nearly as much. So yeah, I leaned towards more Howl from Beyond and less Rip Through Reality, and was happy to have done so.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. And Rip Through Reality, I think, is one of those ones where the threat of it can be something that forces them to inefficiently use Arcane Barrier too, which can be nice, but you don't necessarily need to play many of them for that threat to be there. Just having one, even if they don't see it, they might still play around it. So, the fact that it exists is kind of enough. And if you don't have to have what is a slightly more inefficient card actually in your deck, then that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So you've also got 7 Riftbinds, so 1 blue. Is there anything specific behind that, or?
That's another good question, and I think a lot of chain lists have started moving toward fewer copies of the blue Riftbind, in part due to their own experiences of finding that you have a blue Riftbind in your banish zone quite early in the game. just not being willing to spend the resources uh, to play that card out.
Mm.
And games, especially with this configuration of chain, not going all that long unless uh, you expect for it to be going that long. And the shorter the games are, the less effective the blue and even the yellow rift binds will be. So
Yes. Yeah, the real power of even the yellows comes on those turns where you're actually hitting your first pitches and you've pitched, blue and yellow seeds, and you're able to have really massive banishes with seven banishes hitting all blood deck cards. But other than that, they can be a little underpowered on those early to middle turns as a use of
yeah,
an action
exactly.
point. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then we've got the three Shadow Puppetry, the Soul Reaping, which are pretty sort of self-explanatory, powerful cards. The
Very powerful cards, yeah.
three blue Consuming Volition. Talk us through that. That's an interesting choice over the reds, and as a card, how did it perform for you?
Yeah, and again, I mean, these aren't my ideas necessarily. So, I mean, this is based on Matt Rogers' list that he performed quite well with a couple of weeks ago at a Road to Nationals event himself. And to be perfectly honest, when it comes to the blue slots, always a question of how many uses you might find yourself getting out of a particular card, which is why things like Morvarin Skies are just perfect for the deck. Volition are just one of many cards that could be filling that particular slot.
Yeah.
But on the day itself, um, I may have only played the card twice, but when I played it, I was happy to have done so. Because, especially again in a racing scenario, if you can finish your turn on that card after they clearly signaled that they wanted to have a big turn themselves, you're you're drawing at least one card out of their hand and hopefully upsetting their plan just enough so that you can, with not blocking
Mm-hmm.
and continuing that cycle. So, yeah.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And the meet and greets also in blue. Similar thinking that you've got an on hit effect that is kind of relevant and punishes them a bit for not blocking.
Yeah. Um, when comparing this to the aforementioned Matt Rogers list, he was playing three blue Flock of the Featherwalkers as well.
Yep.
And I can completely understand why those were in the deck. But ultimately, I found that having one more card that did in fact interact with sort of the Shadow Runeblade aspects of the deck felt a bit more secure, as well as that three defense value. Look, you don't want to be using it to block, but occasionally you'll have to.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, yeah, occasionally it's nice to have a card that says go again on it. And if you can combine that with an Art of War on a big turn where you've dealt a whole bunch of arcane and other damage, it can feel like it's doing what it should. So yeah, happy to have used it.
Great. And then you've got three potions. Are you main decking the energy and the two time snap potions, or are they generally coming out of the sideboard?
Yeah, they, along with a few of the other cards, really only come in when I expect to have to play more than 60 cards. And so the Time Snap potions, as many others have done, are mainly coming in for that Prism matchup, just out of respect for the Arclight Sentinel.
Yep.
Whereas the Energy Potion is one of those cards that feels like it can fuel those big turns where you might expect the match to go 10, 11, 12 turns because you're playing against a very defensive deck, and you want to be able to set up a turn where, or maybe even two turns in a row where your banish zone is becoming quite large,
Mm-hmm.
and some combination of energy potions and time snap potions means that you're then hopefully to able to play as much of that banish zone out as possible. Especially when you look at cards like Seeping Shadows and Rip Through Reality, that then might be part of that big turn.
Sure. And Seeping Shadows is one that you mentioned there, which is a one of in the deck. How did you find that performed? Jason Chung's very high on this, according to his Devastation video deck techs.
Yeah.
Some people find the 3 cost a bit prohibitive, but you have got a high density of blues in the deck, and obviously having that, as Jason says, card from the Banished Zone that actually nets you an action point can be quite important and quite powerful. So there's a good reason that the card does cost 3. How did you find that it performed?
That's a good question. And on the day itself, I only had the opportunity to play it once. But when I did, it performed its role really well. So it's one of those cards that you're very happy to see in Banish early. You're very happy to see in hand early because at the very least it pitches for 2, and pitching it early means that you'll see it on those critical turns towards the end.
Yeah.
And look, it's not a card that I'm necessarily looking for, but and as a Chane player yourself, I think we've all had those turns towards the end of the game where we are lacking those go again effects, and we have a hand with more blues than we have at the start of the game, because that's just the nature of the game.
Yep.
And at that point, Seeping Shadows feels like it does a lot of work. So
turning a
it's not
blue
a
into
card.
an action point is kind of okay. In some of those later turns, it's kind of exactly what you want.
Yeah, exactly. And look, it's not my favorite card, so there's an argument for playing an extra rip over that Seeping Shadows, but I was happy with what it did. So, yeah.
Cool. Art of War, kind of self-explanatory. Eclipse in the deck. I haven't actually counted up how many blood deck cards you've got here, but how did you find getting that off? Was it relatively doable?
I would say it happens less often with this version of the deck,
Yeah.
and therefore sits in the sideboard for matchups where you expect to fill your sideboard with some more of those blood dead cards, including that second Howl and the Rip, the Unhallowed Rites, and the Seeping.
Yep.
Because those will be the games where you might actually have 3 or 4 cards in the Banished Zone, and instead of playing any of them, might wait for another turn to then have 7 or 8 perhaps, which will then enable the playing of Eclipse. So, to be perfectly honest, it's not a card that I think people should get too hung up on. It's a really powerful effect in certain matchups, and it definitely deserves its spot in the 80 cards, but if your plan is to play 60 cards, then the Eclipse is not going to do you any good, so the sideboard is a good place for it.
Cool. And how did you find the blue Vexing Malice? That's probably the last interesting slot here. So you've got three of those. How did they perform? Oh, hi, Leon.
Okay. I might... Good boy, Leon. Yes. Okay. Sorry. All right. Do you want me to you let me know? Should I just answer?
Yeah, good to go.
Yeah, the Vexing Mouses, I think, are another one that are quite another slot that's fairly common to chain decks these days. And while it looks innocuous, the fact that it says deal 2 arcane damage can be a really powerful effect towards the end of the game, and contributed to at least one of my wins where the opponent intended on just fatiguing me out, but also only had Arcane Barrier 1. So yeah, it can definitely come in handy, and I've seen a few people play it on turn 1 when going first, just to get in that little bit of extra damage that opponents might not respect. So yeah, it's very good at what it does. Blocks for 3 and pitches for 3, so yeah, all around a good card in the deck.
Awesome. And were there any other kind of concluding thoughts that you had about the deck as a whole, or things you thought people might want to think about? Or even just tips on play?
Yeah, look, the biggest thought I have is that certainly this version of the deck is very much about being aggressive, and finding lines that end up dealing high efficient damage even when your hands look a little inefficient. And being willing to eat large amounts of damage in those first few turns, be it taking 9 or even 15 on turn 2 from a couple of heralds.
Mm-hmm.
If there's no reason to be worried, if it's not a herald every edition, and that's what your life total is for. And if you can come to terms with just taking all that damage, this deck will get to a point by turn 3 or 4 where you're constantly applying so much pressure that the opponent has to respect. And you'll eventually go over the top and get there. So it's a very fun deck to play.
And it requires, from the sounds of it, a little bit of faith. It's a bit of a leap of faith to say, I trust that the deck's going to come through for me.
I think so. And at the same time, if you're just picking up Chane or you've found that your banishers aren't very good, just keep at it. The deck works really well even when your banishers aren't very strong.
Yeah.
And this version, I think, probably plays maybe 32 or 33 Blood Dead cards in the main deck.
Mm-hmm.
So just over 55%, or well, no, actually just under 55%. And that means you're accepting that, at the very least, you can expect half your banishers to be misses. So the deck works completely fine despite that. And I recommend people give it a go and see what they think.
Yeah, sure. I think one thing that I'd probably note as well on that ratio issue is that obviously if you're playing cards like Flock of the Feather Walkers, Enlightened Strike, other things, Plunder Runs earlier in the game on those first 4 or 5 turns and pitching a lot of your blood debt cards, then you're obviously increasing the blood debt density of your deck so that when you do get through to banishing the cards that you've pitched early in the game, you're going to be banishing a higher density of blood debt cards, and that can increase the power of your later turns. And that's one of the reasons why I think some of the fatigue strategies are not quite so strong against Chane unless they can be really confident of being able to absorb all the damage.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree.
Cool. Well, anyway, thanks, Alex, for all your insights. That's been really fantastic to hear a bit more about the deck, and big congratulations on the win. How did it feel getting the tunic? Lastly, that's my last question. How did it feel holding that full art tunic? Was that a nice feeling?
Yeah, it was a very nice feeling. It's a very, very nice card, and the brave people that had stuck around to watch the very end of the match, and the poor staff that were still at the shop just waiting for us to finish up, were very congratulatory. So, yeah, it was a great feeling. It was a very tiring day, but if anything, it's just made me want to, further jump into the game. It's a lot of fun. The people in the community are great, and yeah, I can't wait to play more.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, Alex, and viewers, we'll see you again very soon with some more gameplay action, and I'll be back with some more videos in the Hero Spotlight series as well, kicking off after the Bravo Spotlight the other day. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.
Yeah, see you next time.